The oldest manuscripts we have of the Gospels and other New Testament books are between 100 to 200 years after they were written. So obviously another objection is, how do we know that the manuscripts we currently have match what the disciples originally wrote? Why are there no New Testament manuscripts from the first century and very few from the second century? How do we know that the books haven't been changed a lot over that 100 to 200 years until the earliest manuscript fragments? So, scholars categorize the manuscripts according to the material they were written on as papyrus or parchments. Papyrus was created by splitting reeds, laying thin strips crosswise and pounding them and then letting them dry. It was usually cheaply available in the marketplace at that time in the first century. However, it did not last long, and it would typically fall apart after 50 to 100 years, especially if handled a lot or if used in damp climates. So any documents written on papyrus would have to be recopied frequently to new papyrus as the old ones wore out. Also, about the second century, the physical form of writing material started to change from scrolls to books called codices because it allowed the leaves to last longer with less bending, and it was easier to open quickly to a certain place in the codex rather than scrolling through a scroll. Now, parchment, by contrast, was much more expensive than papyrus usually because it was made from animal skin, such as a cow, a sheep, or a goat. After the animal was killed and skinned, the skin would be soaked and the hair would be scraped off, then it would be dried on a frame for many days, then cut to the right size and sewn into a scroll or book, and could be written on. Parchment had the advantage that it could last for thousands of years, so by the 3rd and 4th century, literary works were generally being written on parchment. But before that time, especially among less wealthy people, they would instead use cheap papyrus as the writing material. So the early Christians generally used papyrus because it was a lot cheaper for them. Also, in addition to early papyri and later parchment manuscripts, early Christians used lectionaries, which were usually from parchment, for church reading. These were collections of scripture passages for weekly readings in the church meetings. Here's a chart showing the count from each century of all the Greek New Testament papyri, parchments, and lectionaries that archaeologists have found. About 50 of these are complete New Testaments, the rest are smaller portions. You could see that in the Middle Ages, starting from the 9th century, there was a huge increase in the number of long-lasting parchment manuscripts being produced by monks in monasteries. Before that time, here's a zoomed-in view of the New Testament manuscripts found in the first 8 centuries. You'll notice that there are about 5 surviving papyrus fragments from the 2nd century, about 35 from the 3rd century, and then from the 4th century onward there was an increasing use of parchment as Christianity finally became legal in the Roman Empire and there was more freedom for scholars to study the New Testament and make long-lasting copies. The 4th century is where the 2 oldest complete New Testament manuscripts were written, about the time that Emperor Constantine commissioned 50 Bible manuscripts. Codex Sinaiticus is estimated to have needed skins from 360 cows and sheep to create it, and it would have needed years to prepare all the pages and copy each of these codices. They were extremely expensive, and you can see why no regular Christian at that time could have been able to afford something like this for his or her personal use in their house. Instead, churches would have made copies of these documents onto cheap papyrus for their weekly use. So the New Testament manuscripts we have found fit the pattern we would expect. Before the 3rd and 4th century, very few manuscripts have survived to today because they were using papyrus, which only lasted a few decades before falling apart and needing recopying onto new papyrus. After the 4th century, we have many of the longer-lasting parchment copies. Actually, a fact that's not widely known is that we have more surviving New Testament manuscripts than for any other ancient author, any other lengthy manuscript of any ancient author. And we also have manuscripts that are closer in time to the original autographs than for most ancient authors. I'll show you a little bit more about this soon. When scholars are dating an ancient literary work, they use not only manuscripts but also citations from the ancient authors, from other ancient authors that are close to that time to help them figure out the date and how reliable the work is. If multiple works by different authors confirm the same historical facts, then that helps to confirm that these facts did happen. If other authors close to that time period cite a particular work, it helps to confirm that work, even if we don't have any surviving manuscripts from that time. Consider the Greek historian named Herodotus, who lived about the middle of the 5th century BC in Athens. In 430 BC, he wrote a work called the Histories about the Persian Empire and their wars with the Greeks. It's a long work, about 9 volumes. Interestingly, though, the first manuscript we have for his history is about 300 years later, and this is a little 5-inch fragment of papyrus discovered in a garbage dump in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, where thousands of other papyrus fragments have also been discovered. Then, over the next 500-year period, we have about 20 papyrus fragments that have survived, all less than 1 page in length. And finally, in the Middle Ages, around 900 AD, we have the first full manuscript of his history, around 1,300 years after he wrote it. How do scholars view this? Do they throw it out and assume it must have been passed down orally for hundreds of years? No, of course not. They assume that there must have been manuscripts of his works, copied from one to the other, even though none of them have survived to today. The reason they do this is that they see that other historians and authors close to Herodotus' time referred to him and to his history. Let's look at another example. How about Thucydides? Thucydides, the first mention we have of him by other authors is at least 100 years after he died, as far as I could tell, by Theophrastus. And again, if I'm wrong, let me know. There's also the fact that the history written by Xenophon starts exactly where Thucydides leaves off, which scholars view as an illusion and showing that Xenophon had read Thucydides' history. Then we have the first manuscript fragment about 150 years after he wrote, but we don't get a full manuscript until 1,300 years later. This gap of centuries between the writing and first surviving manuscript is actually typical for literary works from antiquity because so few manuscripts have survived over the centuries. Let's compare the New Testament Gospels to other classical and historical works from antiquity. Here's a summary graph comparison of the Gospels with 23 other ancient works. The link to all these details is in the description box in the supplement. The dates for the 4 Gospels and Acts are shown by the red crosses, and the other documents are shown as blue dots on this graph. The top line shows the number of years after the document was written until the full, complete, earliest manuscript that we have surviving today. The middle line shows the number of years after writing until the earliest surviving fragment we have today. And the bottom line shows how many years after writing until the documents are cited by some other ancient authors. You can see that the New Testament citation record and manuscript support is among the earliest compared to most other ancient documents. And I'm showing here Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And again, all of these documents are in the supplement available online. Not only are these manuscripts comparatively early, but there are also far more surviving manuscripts available for the New Testament than for any other ancient text. The next most copied text is Homer's Iliad, and that has less than 2,000 manuscripts surviving, whereas the New Testament has 5,800 manuscripts just in Greek, about 19,000 in other languages and lectionaries. Many ancient historians have only 1 or 2 surviving manuscripts until the Middle Ages, like Tacitus, some of these, whereas the New Testament has hundreds. Likewise, the New Testament manuscripts are much closer to the date of writing than the Iliad's manuscripts are, as you can see in this graph. Interestingly, the first New Testament citations are between the New Testament authors themselves. In 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul quotes Luke 10:7. Now, since Paul died between 64 and 68 AD, Luke was likely written before that, and Matthew and Mark were actually likely written before Luke. We'll talk more about the dating later. So in summary, if we apply the same standard to the New Testament that we apply to any other ancient writing, the manuscript evidence is much stronger for the New Testament, both in terms of the number of manuscripts and the closeness to the writing. Now, is there any other evidence? Some people are still skeptical. How can we know these early manuscripts were not radically changed during that first 50 to 100 years of copying? Here's where we can look at the citations from the earliest Christians after the Apostles, called the Apostolic Fathers. In particular, 4 men. Clement of Rome was the leader of the church in Rome during 88 to 99 AD, and he knew the apostles Peter and Paul during their time in Rome in the 60s. He quoted from both Peter's and Paul's New Testament epistles in his own letter to the Corinthians around 99 AD. Some scholars actually date it 30 years earlier. Ignatius of Antioch was a student of the Apostle John and became a church leader in Antioch in Syria. He quoted from many books of the New Testament, including Matthew and Luke, in his 7 letters to the churches of Asia, written around 107 AD when he was on his way to be executed as a prisoner in Rome. Polycarp was another student of the Apostle John, and he became a church leader in Smyrna. He lived a long life and was martyred around age 86. In his letter to the church at Philippi around 135 AD, he quoted from 17 books in the New Testament, including Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the New Testament quotes from these three men show that these New Testament books had circulated around the whole Roman Empire by that point. The New Testament quotes are not usually cited by name, like from the Gospel of Matthew or something, but they simply drop phrases from these books in their own letters, showing that they had read the New Testament books and had memorized many phrases. Finally, one more disciple who had known the Apostle John briefly was Papias, church leader in Hierapolis. He was also a companion of Polycarp, according to Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus. Even though most of his actual writing is lost, several excerpts are preserved by Eusebius in his History of the Church, written about 200 years later. Papias wrote the first explanation of where the Gospel of Mark came from, namely that Mark took notes from Peter's preaching in Rome. Here's a quote. "And the elder John used to say this, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order, of the things said and done by the Lord." And you can read the rest of this quote. It says, "For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he heard, and to make no false statements in them." And Papias also talked about Matthew. So Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So here's a map showing where these four church leaders lived. And also the earliest manuscript fragment from the New Testament, Papyrus P52 from the Gospel of John, was found in Alexandria, Egypt, showing that the New Testament documents had spread and were being quoted all over the Roman Empire, long before the later manuscripts were copied that we still have today.